Greetings fellow mammals, CloakingDonkey here, and I hope you're doing okay. Today I would like to talk about PvE and Camelot Unchained. At this point you've most likely heard somewhere that Camelot Unchained is not going to have any PvE, or if you're entirely new to Camelot Unchained, there have always been rumorings that Camelot Unchained is PvE-less, and it has also been portrayed this way by City State Games, the company making Camelot Unchained. But I would like to take this opportunity to talk us through what exactly that is going to mean, what that entails, and the reasoning for this bold design decision. Now the first thing I want to say is that Camelot Unchained is going to have PvE. However, it is not going to be the kind of PvE that most people are going to expect. I know some of you are probably sick to death at this point of hearing about World of Warcraft in comparison to any other MMORPG, but there is a reason why World of Warcraft is taken as comparison so often, because no other MMORPG has influenced the development of other MMORPGs as much as World of Warcraft. Most MMORPGs that have come out in the last 12 years have in some way been influenced by the genre giant. And the most notable way in which most of these games have been like WoW is the PvE. Most of them came with some kind of structured PvE, be it instanced dungeons or instanced raids, or even just a questing system that is like World of Warcraft's questing system. Meaning you can quest from level 1 to max level by yourself, and the quests give enough gear and experience so that you can comfortably reach the maximum level without having to go off and do a ton of dungeons or anything like that. Notable exceptions to this rule would be Mortal Online and Darkfall. There may be some others that I'm forgetting, but you're getting the point. Even Tree of Savior, a game that is supposed to be the spiritual successor to Ragnarok Online, one of the most grindy MMORPGs of all time, has a fully fledged single-player questing system. It definitely has become the standard in this genre. Much to my personal dislike, by the way. But I don't want to talk too much about questing. The point is that the last games that really went entirely without quests or did something else are 15 to 17 years old at this point. There are people playing MMORPGs right now that weren't alive in the time before questing. And so online you will see plenty of people who are of the opinion that you cannot have an MMORPG without questing. Which is nonsense, because before World of Warcraft there really was no questing systems like that. EverQuest 2 had quite a lot of quests, but even EverQuest 2 had to step up its game, so to speak, to catch up to how World of Warcraft was doing things. And whether we like it or not, this is going to create an expectation in players when they learn about Camelot Unchained. So this is why CSE has been saying there is no PvE in Camelot Unchained, because by the definition of the genre, there really isn't, because Camelot Unchained is not going to have instanced dungeons, instanced raids, and a fully fledged questing system. But if you take the pure definition of PvE, i.e. players versus environment, then Camelot Unchained is still going to have PvE. It is a crafting-based game that has a lot of medium armor. Just watch the video where I complain about Viking armor and you'll realize how much leather there is going to be in this game. And so if you have leather, you need to have animals that you can skin. So already there's going to be animal NPCs that have to be hunted. There are all sorts of things that can be done with monsters and bosses that has nothing to do with a structured PvE. Because that is basically the thing with Camelot Unchained. There is PvE, but there is no structured PvE. And you only need to read a little bit into the lore of Camelot Unchained to realize how incredibly high fantasy it actually is. And because of how high fantasy it is, I fully expect there to be dragons and trolls and all sorts of gribblies that hide in the darkness. Because it is supposed to be a bit of a scary MMORPG in some ways as well, and for that, you kind of need dangerous creatures lurking in the night. But instead of some guy with an exclamation mark standing above his head saying, "I need someone to kill 10 dark devil gribblies," those devil gribblies might just attack your town at night, and you have to defend yourself or your town is going to be burned to the ground by these creatures. Do you see? That's PvE without any crazy structure. Sure, it would need someone to activate a script to have the monsters attack your town, but it wouldn't require a questing system. And then there's of course also the depths, the dungeon of this world. And for those of you who haven't played Dark Age of Camelot and don't know where Darkness Falls is, you have to imagine a big raid dungeon that all 3 realms have access to. It's not instanced, there is one version of the depths, and all 3 factions can go in there, which makes it a PvP dungeon. And there may very well be bosses and monsters in there that you want to kill because they drop crafting materials, or maybe they're just protecting really rare crafting materials and have to be killed for those materials to become accessible. Either way, this is generally going to work in a one faction has access kind of deal, so when something flips in the world, the current realm loses access and the next realm gains access, and they get the opportunity to wipe everyone out in the dungeon and conquer it for themselves to get at the resources or whatever goodies are going to await down there. This system was incredibly popular in Dark Age of Camelot, and it offered more content than a mere normal raid instance could ever offer. Because on top of the cool bosses that dropped crazy loot, you also had to fight against other players at the same time. But let's get down to it. Why is there no focus on PvE, or more appropriately structured PvE, in Camelot Unchained? First of all, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever for a small studio like City State Games to try and cater to every single MMORPG player out there. Because even huge budget games like Star Wars The Old Republic that had budget over $150 million was ultimately not able to deliver an MMORPG that could satisfy everyone. They spread themselves so thin in the development that they kind of ended up attracting basically no one, except for really hardcore Star Wars fans, and maybe for some players who are really into Star Wars and stories and just play through the characters. Even when big studios like BioWare try to cover all the bases with games like Star Wars The Old Republic, something always falls short. Examples of systems that have absolutely fallen short and are awful compared to a lot of other MMORPGs are crafting in World of Warcraft, PvP and raiding in Star Wars The Old Republic, raiding in Lord of the Rings Online, character classes and their gameplay in Elder Scrolls Online, polish in Warhammer Online. And the list keeps going and going and going. Every single one of these games that came after World of Warcraft and tried to please everyone ended up not doing incredibly well because they just didn't really get there in all areas that were necessary, and especially the endgame. And this is partly because I don't think there's a single system in an MMORPG that is going to cost as much money and development time as a structured questing system. Because you need story writers, quest and zone designers, developers who work on balancing and scaling to ensure that you never run out of quests, that you always have the right gear, that none of the classes are struggling with the quests, but also none of the classes are running through them too easily so that you get really bored. You need a lot of quality assurance so that there's no bugs and no issues with the questing or the balancing. You need nigh perfect itemization for all of the classes throughout the questing experience, so that even people who are not going to do any dungeons or who are not going to grind are going to have enough gear to get from level 1 to max level. And then at that point, we haven't even talked about voiceover, which requires sound engineers and people doing the voiceover, which have to be paid, and sound directors, and once again, script writers. The amount of money that goes into these questing systems is absolutely insane. And this of course makes it even worse for smaller studios such as City State Entertainment. I don't think that they would be able to even make a questing system with a budget of $4 to $10 million. This stuff just costs way too much for a smaller team and a smaller project such as Camelot Unchained. And so it absolutely makes more sense for them to focus on the things that they can make with the budget and just make them really well. And so by focusing on PvP, world building, crafting, housing, and seafaring, let's hope that actually makes it in by launch. And by pushing PvE into the background, this gives them the opportunity to make all the other systems much, much better. So how does this affect gameplay in Camelot Unchained? Well, it certainly gives the game the potential to get rid of endgame. If done right, players should be able to engage in what you would call endgame as soon as they leave the tutorial or starter area. Because instead of endlessly grinding quests to reach the maximum level, or spending hours upon hours pugging through dungeons to get enough gear to go into raids, you can just go ahead and start crafting. Or if you're in a guild, you could move out and look for a really cool place to settle and build a city. Or you could just join a warband and go hunt for enemy players. You could guard a caravan from bandits. Or you could build a boat and roam the seas. Again, if seafaring makes it in by launch. But either way, the goal is to open up the world and to give you choices as to what you want to do with your time. Because if you really think about it, in the last 12 years since World of Warcraft has entered the market, have you really ever done anything else than questing once you got into the game? Because that is not choice. You log into these games, and be it World of Warcraft, Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2, Warhammer Online, Age of Conan, Rift, Wildstar, you log in and you start questing right away. There is no choice. Once you've spent 20, 30, or maybe up to the maximum level questing, then you start having choices. You might be able to start leveling with dungeons, or you might be able to start crafting a little bit if the game has any. You might start being able to do PvP, but you always have to start questing. And I understand, for most people, questing is probably a good thing. They like it. I'm in the minority with my opinion that questing is the scourge of the MMORPG world. But even if questing has to be part of the deal, why isn't it optional? Why does everyone have to quest? Why is it the only way to properly progress in the game? That's the problem I have with questing. But again, let's not get too far into questing, and let's get back to Camelot Unchained, which doesn't have any of that. The cool thing about having these choices is that you can go out into the world, and instead of the game telling you some cheesy ass story that is just never going to be as good as a single player RPG storyline, it's always going to be a rubbish MMO storyline. Instead of that, you can go out and make your own stories with your friends or with random people that you meet. And those stories that you write yourself, there's just everyday interactions between players as you meet on the field of battle or you meet somewhere in the wild. Those stories are going to stick with you so much longer than all of these crappy questing storylines that nobody is going to remember 2 years later. So what might we actually expect from PvE in Camelot Unchained? Now this is of course mostly speculation territory, because when it comes to the topic of PvE, Mark Jacobs and CSE have been a bit tight-lipped about what they are actually planning on doing. I would be shocked if there were no NPCs in this world, but to what extent they are really going to be there at launch, that is the question. Now the first thing I'm thinking is that while there are definitely going to be animals and maybe even monsters roaming the wilds, there are probably going to be nowhere near as many as there are in, say, World of Warcraft, where the monsters are nicely segregated into leveling areas, and there's always just enough for you to do your quests and for somebody else to do their quest, and there's monsters everywhere. I would imagine that the monster density would probably not be as high in Camelot Unchained, and that they would maybe even be a little bit more out of the way, so in the forests, in the mountains, in caves and all that. Now the next thing is, because Camelot Unchained doesn't really have a leveling system per se, and only sort of has a character progression system through PvP, I don't think the monsters will have levels. I think they will be differently strong, but this won't have anything to do with level, just sort of more with their stats, and maybe abilities. And it's more going to be a thing of how many players are you going to need to kill these monsters reliably, instead of how far do you have to progress before you're allowed to attack this monster. I could definitely see some rare crafting materials coming from monsters, such as trolls, or dragons. I mean, as much as I hate the bone armor for the Vikings, those bones have to come from somewhere. And if they're dragon bones and dragon scales, then, well, I guess there will have to be dragons, right? And it would be good to have this, because it would give the adventurers, or fighting players, a reason beyond boredom to go out and slay these creatures. NPCs such as goblins or undead could also defend or attack resource areas, further strengthening the bond between crafters and adventurers. All in all, think of PvE in Camelot Unchained not like PvE in World of Warcraft or other World of Warcraft-like games, but think of it more like pet battles in World of Warcraft, sort of a distraction and side game from the main game. Alright guys, I hope I could shed some light on some of this PvE stuff in Camelot Unchained, because I do think it's important to have a healthy discussion about these things in the game. And if you have a different opinion from me, do feel free to tell me about it in the comments. I would love to have discussions about these topics with you guys. Look forward to plenty more installments in this particular series, as I have lots to say about Camelot Unchained and its systems. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.